The Zlob Diode Chaos module has 3 independent semi-random voltage outputs, as well as a trigger output. I've been watching the relationship between the trigger and some of the CVs, and thought this might make an interesting module to create generative music. I noticed on the Zlob that whenever the trigger goes high, the yellow trace on the scope, the yellow cable here, the bottom jack, that the Z output, the pink cable, the magenta trace on the scope, rises as if it's an attack stage. Let's go ahead and get another trigger out of here so I can show you what that looks like. There's one. I'll pause the run, and you can see whenever we get that yellow pulse there, that the red trace rises. The other two traces, X and Y, green and blue, seem to be somewhat unaffected. They keep wandering around on their own. So the first thing I thought was, that might make an interesting filter envelope, while the other two controlled other parameters of the timbre. So, with that in mind, let's set up a patch. I'll let it run again. I've got a drone set up with 2 oscillators, the Mother 32, as well as one of the distings. I've got it running through an external VCA because I needed an envelope with a very long time, longer than the Moog has built into it. And let's go ahead and bring up that drone so you can hear it. I have the 2 oscillators set at an interval. Here's the Mother's oscillator. Here's the disting. And that mix happens to be voltage controllable. The cutoff is also, of course, voltage controllable. And it so happens that both the Mother's pulse width and the wave shape over on the disting can also be voltage controlled. So those are the 3 parameters I'm going to play with modulating from the Zlob's different CV outputs. The trigger I'm going to use to forward a sequencer to change the pitch of a note, and also to fire the VCA just to create a little bit of an envelope to the notes. So first I'm going to take the X output, the green trace, and I'm going to put that to the timbre, or the wave shape of the 2 modules. I have a splitter cable going to the VCO modulation depth, which is the pulse width on the Mother 32, and also to the wave shape on the disting. And I'll plug that into the output of the green side, the X side. You can hear the timbre change as that green trace goes up and down. Then I'm going to use a Y output, the blue trace on the scope, to go ahead and change the mix between those 2 oscillators. So I've got a cable running to mix CV here, and let's go ahead and patch that to the through output for that Y output. And you notice that whenever Y rises, we get more of the disting oscillator. And as it falls, we get more of the Mother 32's higher pitch oscillator. And finally, I'm going to take the filter cutoff here and plug it into the Z output, this magenta trace. So whenever we get a pulse, we're going to get a little bit of an envelope, and also a gently moving cutoff frequency. There you can hear one of those fake envelopes. Finally, I'm going to take the trigger output of the Zlob, yellow trace, and use it to step my sequencer along. And I found it was more reliable than to take the gate output of the sequencer to fire my envelope for the VCA, as well as to step the sequence. Sometimes there's a little bit of a rounding or slope to that pulse coming out of the Zlob, and I noticed that sometimes I would cause the envelope to fire before the sequencer stepped. So let's go ahead and plug that in down here. Hear the filter rise during the attack phase while the gate is high, the trigger output is Zlob. Let's go ahead and pull this down a little bit so we hear a little bit more of the VCA's envelope, while the other CVs randomly move in a nice chaotic fashion to change the timbre, the filter cutoff, and the mix between the oscillators. Now the interesting thing about the Zlob is this rate control also affects the complexity and the voltage ranges of each of those outputs. If I was to speed it up, I would get more triggers. And you notice that the X and Y outputs, the green and blue traces, have a little bit of a wider range, particularly the X output. But the magenta output, the Z, actually has a lower amplitude. Whereas if I slow it way down, we're going to get fewer triggers, but different shapes and excursions out of our chaotic voltages. Notice it's not even a real clean pulse there. We're getting a wider sweep out of our Z output, the magenta trace, which is controlling the filter's cutoff. Now let's speed it up and see what happens. At these higher rate settings, you'll notice that the green trace now starts to more closely follow the trigger output, giving an additional hump whenever there's a trigger. That did not happen at lower rates, but is very pronounced at higher rates. Again, the green, the X output, is going to the timbre, or the wave shape, of our two oscillators. Now, as you get towards the end of the rate knob here, the Zlob starts acting unpredictably. Matter of fact, let's go ahead and slam it to the extreme and back it down. It's running at audio rate now on the trigger outputs. And you'll see that the green output, the X, is trying to keep up. I'll back off. And just suddenly exits that oscillation and enters oscillation again. Again, at higher rates, for some reason the Z output reduces in amplitude, so we're not getting a lot of filter cutoff. All of our timbre changes are coming from the X output. So I'm going to go ahead and raise the cutoff just for this. Now it's almost periodic. Back it off just a little bit. Great to find these areas in the chaotic response where we're getting those pauses and then cyclic behavior, and back to pauses again. Go ahead and go up to crazy rates again. Now we'll back off to slightly slower rates, where we get radically different behavior. Now we're back to our very slow, gentle evolution. And now the magenta trace has a little bit more amplitude to it. That's the Z output going to the filter cutoff. Now we'll go to slow extreme just to show you the contrast. At the very low rates, the amplitude of the CV outputs also seems to be suppressed, and the triggers are slowed down. It's between those two extremes that we get more range out of the CV outs. That's a simple demonstration of how you can use a chaotic control voltage and trigger generator to help drive a generative voice.